Pencils, notebooks, lockdown browsers. According to the New York Times, those are the new tools of the high school English classroom. Not because teachers want to turn back the clock, but because AI made take-home writing unteachable. Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. Today, we're looking at a piece in the New York Times that documents a national pattern many of us are seeing, and I want to add a personal lens because I don't think the binary the article presents is the whole picture. The piece we're talking about is How AI Killed Student Writing and Revived It by Dana Goldstein, published April 30th. Now, flagging up front, Goldstein notes that she composed the article without AI, but she did use AI to sort through about 400 educator responses to a call out, and I appreciate the kind of transparency, methodological transparency, and that's exactly what I think educators should come to expect. So here's the data point that anchors the piece, and we'll dive in a little bit further from here. According to the RAND polling, between May and December of 2025, the share of students regularly using AI for homework jumped from 48% to 62%. A third use AI to draft or revise writing. And here's the part that I think really gives us pause. 2/3 of the same students said they believe AI is harming their critical thinking. They're using it, they know it's costing them something, and they're using it anyway. I think this also resonates with recent survey on Gen Z response to AI and the bitterness and resentment that is growing in that population. What Goldstein documents is the teacher response. Take-home writing assignments are dropping out of the curriculum because integrity can't be policed. Teachers are moving writing back into the classroom by hand or on lockdown browsers. Jessica Binney, an AP literature teacher in Katona, New York, gave up the 3 to 5 page paper that used to be her staple and now has students write essays in class in their notebooks on a Derek Walcott poem, for example. Teachers in this article express something close to relief at giving up on the imperfect science of AI detection. So do the students. One John J. Sr., Cassidy Tondorf, said, quote, "It's a relief, there's less distraction," end quote. So that's the picture, and here's what I want to add to it. A few episodes back, I think it was episode 8, we walked through the research on handwriting versus typing. I won't repeat that ground here, but the short version is that handwriting encodes more deeply, supports memory and processing. Typing supports fluency, length, and revision. These are different tools for different types of cognitive work. Feel free to go back to that episode to get a deeper dive. There's something that Times article doesn't get to, and I want to share a personal experience that explains why I'm watching this trend personally with two minds at once. Let me take you back to my freshman year of college. I took a class that spring that I genuinely loved. It was called The Wasteland on T.S. Eliot's poem and many of the related works. It was the kind of subject matter I would have happily lived with for a full semester, and I did, except that the entire grade rested on 3 in-class essays, 3 timed handwritten responses. That was the entire assessment. I thought I could manage that going in, but it turns out I could not. What my professor said after reading one of my in-class essays was that my writing had, and it's hard to forget this phrase, quote unquote, literary cul-de-sacs. What he meant was that I would write myself into dead ends. I'd start a thought, follow it down a path, and I'd find myself painted into a corner and I had no time to paint my way out of it. In a timed handwritten essay, I couldn't meaningfully revise. I couldn't move a paragraph. I couldn't back up and restructure. Now, about me, I should say that I'm a writer who I would say plans on the fly. I write to figure out what I think, and I revise constantly. If you take the keyboard away, and with it, my ability to revise, you're taking away a big portion of how I actually write. So what I put on the page in those exams, I don't feel was a fair representation of how I thought about T.S. Eliot and the other works we were reading. It was more a representation of how I performed under handwriting in a time situation. After that semester, I made a deliberate decision. I avoided humanities classes that assessed primarily through timed in-class writing. I sought out take-home essays, 24-hour exams, multi-week papers. And I should say that since my freshman year, I can think of only one time in the decades since then that I've had to write a timed handwritten essay. And that was when I had to get my teaching certification in my first year of teaching. After that, I never had to write another timed handwritten essay. It wasn't not for work, not for life. The thing that I was being assessed on as a college freshman is not a medium that I ever needed to use again professionally, save that one exception. Now, I'm sharing that not as a biography, but because it matters for how we read the Times piece. the medium becomes the assessment in ways that teachers don't always intend. The student who can think but can't compose by hand under time pressure is being measured on something that wasn't supposed to be in the construct of measurement. The construct was supposed to be about reading, analysis, argument, but what actually gets measured includes handwriting fluency and the ability to plan in your head before your pen hits the paper, or your ability to sketch quickly through an outline by pen on paper and then revise as you go. So when I read that classrooms are swinging hard back towards handwritten in-class writing as the AI defense, I read that with a lot of care and attention. The defense against AI is real, and I take that very seriously, but the unintended cost is also very real for writers like myself. We are drafty thinkers who plan through the act of writing, not before it. Now, what's heartening is that in classrooms I'm seeing using Newsella Writing, teachers are doing something more interesting than just choosing a side. Students are starting on paper, they're using a graphic organizer to lay out their thinking, they draft the initial frame by hand, and then they retype that draft into Newsella Writing, where they get a round or two or three of rubric-based feedback that they use to revise on the computer. I think this is notable because the sequence does several things at once. It keeps the planning and the initial composition where they belong with the student on paper in their own words, where the work is harder to outsource. The handwriting is a check on authorship. The cognitive work that benefits from a slower medium happens in the medium that actually slows you down. Then the moment in the writing process when the digital medium genuinely helps, revision, restructuring, getting structured feedback, that happens in the digital tool. The AI plays a constrained rubric-bound role, and it's not writing for the student, it's reflecting their writing back to them with a structure bounded by the rubric. So there's a side benefit also I think that matters, is that students are therefore going to spend less time on devices. They're going to be able to focus their attention on paper, and then they're going to come to the device with a specific purpose. When they're done with that purpose, they get off the device. The device doesn't become the whole environment. It's a station within the environment. And I think that's a more precise mapping of the medium to its best use than either side of this binary that the Times piece is painting. So on that, let me just say a word about what I think the article gets right and where I think it misses a little bit. AI detection is a dead end, and that's absolutely right. Students themselves are reporting relief, and that's not nothing. Not every teacher in the article is retreating, however. Megan Hard at South Forsyth outside Atlanta is the clearest example of redesign rather than retreat. She's teaching students to use AI for source evaluation and feedback while pulling drafting back into the classroom. But what I think the article misses is that the framing makes it sound like a choice between paper and AI. And I think the more interesting story, and what I've been seeing when I've been going into classrooms, is that it's a both and. It's paper and AI. It's sequenced thoughtfully through the writing process. And I think there's real design work behind that choice that teachers are doing that gets lost in the way that the New York Times article is painting this as a dichotomy. So here's a suggestion to try something this week if you're teaching writing. Have students pre-write on paper, use a graphic organizer, brainstorm, outline, make an initial draft on paper, then retype the paper draft into the digital writing environment. Use AI feedback for 1 or 2 revision rounds, and then use that 3-column reflection that I mentioned in a previous episode, where you're asking students when they read the feedback from the AI, first column, what do I agree with? Second column, what don't I agree with? And the third column, what will I do next? Then take a final pass on the device. And in that way, you're going to use each stage is going to fit the medium that best fits the cognitive work of that stage. The student's authorship is anchored in the handwritten artifact, which is not going to be AI generated. Now, I'm talking about switching a lot, and I should just caveat this, that when you're switching media like this from paper to digital, there's certainly a cognitive cost. And that transition, you have to kind of weigh against the cost for an individual student. For a struggling writer, the right answer might be to limit the number of stages, even reduce them and have them just write by hand entirely. But the basic idea is to take a moment here. The principle that I want to underscore is to take a moment to map the medium to the cognitive purpose. How you sequence that for each student is, I think, the teacher's instructional design choice. So in wrapping, the story the Times tells is the story of teachers reacting. And the story that I'm watching when I get out into classrooms is actually more of a story of teachers designing. They're not the same story. Reactivity sends the laptop home, brings the notebook back, but design asks a sharper question. At this moment in the writing process, what is the student's cognitive work and what medium actually serves it? And I think if we get that question right, we won't have to choose between the blank page and the blinking cursor. We can use both, and in the right order for the right reasons. Maybe the next student who would have written themselves into a literary cul-de-sac gets a different shot at saying what they actually thought. Those are my thoughts. I would love to know yours. Please use the comments and tell me what your experience has been teaching writing in the age of AI and how you're moving, if you are, between paper and digital, whether you've shifted entirely to paper. How is your district giving you advice on this topic? And who are you listening to for guidance? Thanks, and we'll see you again tomorrow.